morning, everybody, or afternoon, I guess, depending on where you're at. Please feel free to turn on your cameras. I can see your faces, and it's good to see a few people that I know and a few new faces. Thomas, great to see you. Joelle, nice to see you. Karen, I can see you. Um, so today we're here at the Office 365 Savings Symposium, and my objective today really is kind of twofold. We're gonna deep dive. This is going to be a real deep session on Office 365 and Microsoft 365 and sort of the related services and how licensing really works. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the goal is to start to show how you can take out 20 to 40% of your costs on these products. We've reviewed somewhere north of 3 million Office 365 accounts now, and we're averaging 29% reduction in spend. And I'm going to show you where that reduction comes from and how you can actually start to go about and identify that inside of your own organization, or a couple of our partners are on the call today, and talk about how you can take these sorts of ideas and concepts into your customer base to help them start to identify this savings, because it is massive. We had a client recently come to us, a very large retailer. If we said the name, we're under NDA, we can't, but if we said the name, everybody would know them. And they have over 300,000 email accounts with Microsoft on Office 365 and the various components that go with it. And they came to us after they had been negotiating with Microsoft for nearly a year on their EA renewal. It had expired. They were 2 weeks into an extension, and they just didn't know what to do. They were literally facing a 40% uplift on what they were spending based on how Microsoft had made some changes and things like that. Inside of a week, we took that 40% and flipped it upside down. They ended up decreasing their spend by 20%. And I'm going to show you how we did it today. Okay, so this is not we're not going to be having a high level, here's how licensing works. I want to dig into the weeds. If you have questions, please raise your hand and ask them throughout. We're going to have some sessions as well as we go through the agenda today, where there's lots of time to sort of interact and work with some of your peers to share best practices, but also ask questions of myself and my team. There's a number of my team members here on the session as well today. So before we get really into it, one of the things that I get asked a lot is, Mike, why did you get into this? And so for those of you that are new to Metrics Data, we are a firm that focuses on sort of software asset management, but really the cost optimization side of that and the audit defense. And so I think what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start with a little bit of the background, my background and why I got into this. And then we're going to roll straight into rolling up our sleeves and getting into it. But here's really what happened for me and why, my driving mission is to help my clients save money on software licensing. And it was because I became a monster. I literally became a monster. I had this vision when I was 13 years old, sitting at the kitchen table and my mom coming home. And it was a strange way that she came home, because she always came home and sat down and talked to me and said, well, how's your day going? And what are you working on? And what do you got going on tonight? But this day was different. She actually went straight to her room, and I could actually hear her in her bedroom sobbing. And my stomach dropped and I knew what was wrong. I grew up in this really small town where my mom was an IT administrator at the only factory in town. It was probably a really good job for the town that I grew up in, because there weren't very many, businesses in town other than sort of like the retail stores or maybe the McDonald's restaurant. And I knew for the last few months leading up to this, she had a lot of sleepless nights, because she was talking about how she was trying to renegotiate some contracts with her vendors, trying to save money, and she needed to find savings because they were threatening to shut the plant down and move it to Mexico. And she needed to put money back in her IT budget to help try and save the plant. And that was the night that they told her they were actually closing the plant. And the thing was, my mom's masters, her software vendors, where she was having a hard time sleeping at night trying to save money, they sucked her budget dry, and people were losing her jobs. It literally took her 3 days to come out of her room. And that had such a huge impact on me and my family at the time. And I remember telling myself, I'm never going to let this happen to me. So when I actually got a job at Microsoft in the licensing group, I thought I'd made it. I quickly became on the fast track. I was flying out to Redmond, being put on special teams to build out licensing programs, working with product teams on how they did product licensing. And in a few couple of short years, I'd actually negotiated over $1 billion in contracts for Microsoft, and I'd learned all the tips and tricks of the game. But it was in 2009 when the economy had taken a downturn that I found that I couldn't sleep at night. And I was sitting up at night watching, like wasting time watching stupid infomercials and things like that at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I knew something was wrong. And it was when my daughter actually came up to me and said, what was wrong? That I realized that I'd become the monster that kept my mom up at night. That, she was trying to save jobs for people, and I was trying to sell more to my clients in a time when they needed to save money. And the thing is, I was really good at it. I knew that I could sell them 20, 30, 40% more software than they needed or wanted. And I knew that I could use the complexity and the confusion of software licensing to get them to do that. And I knew that I had more information on them than they did on themselves about the use of our software. And I knew if they were lucky to spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars implementing software asset management tools. So some organizations I knew had these things. I knew they weren't getting the information out of them that they actually needed. And I could actually use their own software asset management tools and the data out of them against them in order to go and sell them this 20, 30, 40% more. Um, but the thing that I knew the most was that many of them, like a lot of you on the phone, were just trying to figure out how many licenses do I actually need? How can I save my company money? And they were doing it in spreadsheets. They were getting information from multiple parts of the organization, and that as a vendor, I could use that disorganization against you to drive up what you were spending with us. And that's when I realized that that was the monster. I was now the monster that was keeping some other, one of my customers up at night, and it was his or her kid that was sitting at the table when they came home. And so for me, I realized that that's not who I wanted to be. And so I made a switch, and I wanted to do the right thing. And that's when I started the organization. I wanted to take the knowledge that I've learned about how to sell, how licensing really works, because that's a challenge for most organizations. Is they don't really understand how licensing works. They know what a program is, so they'll buy an EA or they'll buy from a CSP program, but they really truly don't know how licensing works or understand how licensing works. And I wanted to use that information in the right way and help companies get a fair deal on software. And so I honestly believe that companies are spending way too much on software. Gartner and Forrester and the likes will tell you that if you implement software asset management programs, that you can save, 20, 30, 40% on your software in the first year if you do it correct. And they're not wrong, because these organizations were using all this data to make it more complicated, to force you to buy more than you need. When I was at Microsoft, they made us proud to say, the bundle is the bundle. It's like cable TV. You want Sportsnet? You got to take these other 6 channels that we know you're never going to use. Oh, you want Exchange Online? You got to take all these other 6 products that we know you're never going to use, and we're going to charge you for them regardless, because the bundle is the bundle. So over the next couple hours, we're really going to talk about how to get better data. We're going to focus on Office 365 today, or Microsoft 365 and the components thereof. I'm going to teach you how licensing really works, how to create a value gap with Microsoft, and then I'm going to start to give you some of the tactics that you can use to take control of your software budget and beat these guys at their own game, and put that 20 to 40% savings back in your own IT, your own IT budget. Okay, so that's what we're really going to focus on today. But before we get there, I want to give one other story about why I think it's important to work with a team. And this is a team approach when it comes to doing this. No one individual can do this alone and go up against Microsoft. Or I'm about to talk about the marlin that is Microsoft. For those of you that fish, the marlin is a great big huge fish. But you need a team, whether that's with outside experts, whether that's with your reseller or your value added partners, or whether that's internal. You need a team. So I know that there are people on this call that have a lot of experience with Microsoft, and I know that there are some that are sort of newer to Microsoft licensing. So the first thing I wanted to do was talk a little bit about how to purchase Office 365. Now, when I say Office 365, insert or change that for Microsoft 365, change that for Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Skype or Teams, even Office. That includes all the security products. That includes EMS, like the EMS suite. That includes Power BI. And if you don't know what these are, don't worry, we're going to get into those a little bit later today. But just think of this as any of the online services, with the exception of Azure. Now, the same concepts that we're going to talk about today work with Azure, except for you're going to look at data a little bit differently. But think about any of the online services that Microsoft offers, we're going to be talking about today in the, sorry. So this is not just about Office 365, I guess is where it was going. So the other thing to note, if you're newer to Zoom, if you click on the, I think it's, I don't get it right now. Oh, participants on the ribbon, a list of participants will come up, and I believe that's where you can raise your hand. So if you've got a question, there's two ways that you can catch my attention. One is raise your hand. I've got it up, and if I don't see it right away, I will catch it. It might take me a couple of minutes because it's off on one of my other screens here. Or the other way is pop me a question in the chat box. Okay. But if you raise your hand, I'll unmute you, and we can pop up and talk about answering your question. So the first thing I want to go through is there's two ways, there's more than two, but there's two primary ways that companies purchase Office 365. And by companies, I mean organizations of a couple hundred users and bigger. And the first is what they call an enterprise agreement, and the second is the cloud and service provider program, or the CSP program. And I'm going to talk about both of them, okay? So the enterprise agreement is for larger enterprises. It starts at 500 users or devices. That has changed. It used to be 250 about, I think it's been almost 3 years ago now. Microsoft basically said that they were going to stop doing EAs for people between 250 and 500 users. But you may still see a couple of people out there that have an EA that is 250 or 300 people. But for the most part, these start at 500 users. It is Microsoft's preferred vehicle to sell licenses. I'm going to go through why here in a couple of minutes. It inherently, now with Office 365, which is what we're talking about, those are subscription licenses. But the way that Microsoft sells their upgrades or their maintenance is through something called software assurance, or SA. And the EA software assurance is embedded into. So you can either only buy subscription licenses or licenses with software assurance. And so why that's important is if you want to buy a Windows Server license or a Project or Visio license, you can purchase those on the EA, but you actually require those to have software assurance on them. There's no option just to buy a license only. It has to have that software assurance included with it. I tell people all the time, this is where Microsoft goes. We've literally heard people, Microsoft reps tell customers that if they're not an EA, they're not a partner, they're not a valued customer, they need to be in the EA. And so for our partners that sell CSP, I am going to talk about this when I talk a little bit more into the CSP, because there's definitely some advantages to that program, especially with the Office 365 products. But you may feel resistance if you're selling into the space that is greater than 250 users from Microsoft, trying to sell them enterprise agreements. Now, I will say from a pricing perspective, an EA, one of the other things to know about an EA is that an EA is direct with Microsoft, except for in some government cases and in certain areas of the world. But in North America, for the most part, EAs are what Microsoft refers to as direct. And so in other words, Microsoft controls the pricing and they bill the customer. There's about a little over a dozen partners in North America that can sell EAs. And the way that they receive their remuneration is Microsoft pays them back-end rebates to perform services for the customer and for Microsoft. So the reseller in that case doesn't actually sell the licenses. They just receive fees from Microsoft for services, okay? Now, I'm gonna jump on to a little bit of a digital whiteboard here. Haley, can you give me a thumbs up? Do you see the whiteboard or is it still the PowerPoint deck? Okay, whiteboard's up, good. So the reason I bring this up is one of the things to understand and truly understand why Microsoft sells the way they do is to understand a little bit of the history. And so the way that an enterprise agreement started is it starts with 3 products, or historically started with 3 products. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. It started with Office Pro, the Windows OS. So that's your Windows 10 nowadays. Back in the day, it was XP or Vista, if anybody actually deployed that. And then it also includes what is called, okay, so we got Office Pro, we got the Windows OS, and it also included what is called a Core Cal. And inside of the Core Cal, so a Cal, if you don't know, it stands for Client Access License. And a Client Access License allows you to connect to a server on premise back in the day. So in there, you've got Windows, you got System Center, you had Exchange, and you had SharePoint. And so the way that the EA works is, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, is these products are either device-based licenses or user-based licenses, okay? And if they were device-based, which was Office and Windows OS, in order to get into an EA, every single one of your devices, so think about laptops and desktops, needed to be licensed for Office and Windows. The Core Cal could be licensed by device or user, and you would make a determination there depending on your counts, because if you think about an organization that is one-to-one to device to user, maybe user cal makes sense, maybe it's device cal. But if you go into like a manufacturer or even a bank or retailer where they have a kiosk scenario where you have one device that maybe 20 people use, you don't want to buy 20 user cals for those 20 people. You just wanted to buy one device. And so they allowed you to license this thing either device or user based. And the EA basically started with 1, 2, or all 3. Okay, so I could do an EA back in the day just for Office. I could do it just for the Core Cal. I could do it for Windows and Office, or I could do it for all 3, any combination thereof. And the only thing was, when I'm first starting out, I talked about this concept of software assurance. When I'm first starting out, I buy a license and software assurance. And then at the end of 3 years, because these are a 3-year deal, I own the license and then I would renew just on software assurance. And so in the EA, if I was a brand new company, and let's just keep it easy, I have 1,000 devices, I want all 3, I'd buy 1,000 Office, Windows OS, and Core Cal. I'd pay LNSA, they'd equally split that over 3 years, and I would basically pay for 3 years, okay? So what ended up happening was back in about the time they launched Vista, and I have very little hair left because of these days, but nobody actually started to deploy Vista, right? There were no corporations deploying it. They were all sticking with XP, waiting for Windows 7 to come out. And I see Thomas nodding his head because he remembers these days of Microsoft probably pounding Vista on companies and nobody actually using it. And so what ended up happening was when you signed an EA at LNSA, if you bought all 3, you got a 15% discount on the 3 products, which when you were selling an EA, because if you remember back then, it was just the Windows Pro version, right? So I bought Windows through OEM. This is an upgrade license. It was not a net new. I couldn't buy a PC without the OS and use my EA. I had to buy Windows Pro. So in essence, everybody was double paying for the OS. And so with the 15% discount, you basically were paying about $2 for the OS if you wanted Office and the Core Cal. So it was very easy to convince customers to take all 3. But what happens is in the renewals, when the SA comes up, they actually took the discount from 15 to 5%, and Windows ended up costing 30% or $30 a device. Okay, so you think about organizations with tens of thousands of devices, it was millions of dollars a year for something they're buying OEM and for the upgrade rights to Vista, which was a product they were not going to deploy. And so the Windows OS revenue started to go down. And so what Microsoft actually did was put together a team that I happened to be part of to try and figure out how to solve this. And what they ended up doing was saying, we need a different version of the OS. And that's when they launched the Windows Enterprise Edition. And we're going to put features in the Enterprise Edition that are not available in the OEM Edition so that our EA customers get value for what they're paying for. And we don't lose all this revenue as people renew and don't renew the OS. And so that was the first time they made a differentiation on the OS. And there were some products in there that were perpetual rights. So if I bought BitLocker, for instance, I got to continue to use BitLocker. So I could purchase it once, own it, continue to use the Enterprise Edition, continue to use BitLocker. But there was other components that they put into a product called MDOP, Microsoft Desktop Optimization Package, that were subscription only. And then they went out and hooked people on those subscriptions. And so what happened was when they came up to renewal, they're like, well, I don't want to pay for the OS. I'm not using Vista. I've now got the enterprise features. I'm going to go on a OS holiday. And then they go, oh, hold on, you're using this feature and this feature, and that's a subscription. The only way you can get that is to have SA on the OS. And so they started to really like this subscription thing because the Windows OS came. Then comes cloud computing. And so there were all kinds of iterations of Office 365 prior to Office 365. At one point in time, it was called BPOS, Business Productivity Online Suite, and there are about 4 or 5 names of it, but we're going to skip a little bit of the history and go to O365. And so basically, Microsoft decided that they wanted to get into the SaaS game, and they went out and developed O365. And so O365, how it replaces this traditional EA becomes important because what they did was they came up with a product and they called it Office 365 E3. And I shouldn't call it a product because it's not a product. You can't actually install Office 365 E3. It's a marketing brand, right? The products inside of an Office 365 E3 were Office Pro, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, and about 30 other things that nobody ever uses. Okay. And so if you look at this as a product, it replaces this Office Pro here, and it replaces 2 Exchange and SharePoint in this core cal. So what happened was as they went to that, 2 things happened. Now all of a sudden, Office that was device-based became a user-based license, which was great for Microsoft, by the way. It drove the share price for about 3 or 4 years because most organizations have more users than devices. You think about the biggest companies in the world, manufacturers, retailers, banks, they have more users, hospitals, right? Governments, they have more users than they have devices. You even take a city, right? You take a city, they've got people that fix ditches and plow streets, and they're not actually using computers. And in a city, they normally have about 1.5 users per PC. So Microsoft got a big bump when they pushed everybody to this O365 E3 model. Okay, because now all of a sudden, if you were licensing 1,000 Office Pro, you were licensing 1,500, or in some cases 3-4x the number that you were licensing in a device-based model. Okay. The other thing that this did was it took these 2 products, Exchange and SharePoint, and said, okay, these products are actually in O365. So you may hear of this thing called a core cal bridge. Okay. So what they did when they first launched Office 365, let's see if I can make this a little smaller now. When they first launched Office 365, they said you can still buy Office Pro, or you can buy Office 365 E3. You buy the Windows Pro, and instead of a full core cal, you can either buy the core cal if you're doing Office Pro, just Office Pro. But if you're doing the O365 version, you buy a core cal bridge. Okay. And the Core Cal Bridge basically did not include the Exchange and SharePoint because I was paying for it as part of this E3 license. Okay, so if you see a Core Cal Bridge, because they're still out there, if you're working with a client and they say, oh, I got the Core Cal Bridge, all it is Windows and System Center and the rights to access Windows and System Center on premise, basically. Okay. And so for a while they ran like this, right? And they said, okay, this is great. They then started to make some more changes, right? Because the Core Cal was still a perpetual license. So at the end of the EA, if I didn't want to renew it, I owned the current version of Windows Server and System Center, right? Well, that became a little bit of a problem because most organizations don't upgrade Windows and System Center as quickly as Microsoft does releases. And so they made a change and made this subscription only, right? And then they realized that this was such a great model because now nobody owned Office Pro anymore. It was a subscription. And basically what they were able to do was just keep people renewing because they didn't own it. So they couldn't say, well, I own Office 2013 and I'm not going to upgrade for 10 years. So I'll walk away from it. They would go, well, hold on. You don't own it because it was in a subscription called Office 365 E3. Okay. So what did they do next? The next thing they did was they said, man, we've still got this OS out there and it's a perpetual license and we've done a great job of flipping people to subscriptions here and here. Let's create this thing called M365, okay? And I'm just talking about the E3s. We're gonna get into the difference between E1 and E3 and E5 and F plans a little later on, but just for now, you know, you take a Microsoft 365 E3 and what does it do? It now gives me that O365 E3. It gives me the Windows OS. I now call it an E3 just to make it follow the same thing. And they give an EMS E3. And an EMS is really your Windows and your System Center into a subscription chucked in with Azure Active Directory Plan 1 and a couple other things that nobody ever uses, okay? But we're gonna just call this an M365. So it's like an Uber bundle. Now it's just one part number and everything's fully subscription based, okay? So that's the history of what Microsoft did. And this is what they've done to their clients over time. And so now here we are in 2020. The first EAs came out in, well, I sold the first one globally in 1999, I think. So, you know, they've been going, they've had a good 20 plus year run, right? And this is what they've done on the main products. And so basically these are what you consider enterprise products with Microsoft, okay? And then they have additional products. And additional products are everything else. So I need Windows and SQL servers and Project and Visio and Power BI and Power Apps and Dynamics CRM and things like that. Those are an additional product. And the importance in those I'm going to talk about here in a couple of seconds. But the last thing that I want to talk about on this EA concept before we move on and go into a little bit more of the details is the way that they worked was I sign in year one. And let's just use a simple number. I have 1,000 and I pay for 1,000X, okay? Then I come along in year two, I pay 1,000X. So X is an annual price that I've negotiated with Microsoft. And I also am committed to pay in year three, 1,000X. Okay, so whatever X is, say, let's just say it's today, I bought 1,000 M365 E3s and I'm paying $40 a license. Right, so I pay 1,000 times 40 times 12 months, whatever that math works out to be, that's how much I pay, okay? And so these are the enterprise products, okay? And it's a pre-commitment upfront. So if I sign this EA, let's keep it easy, January 1st, on January 1st, I pay 1,000X. On January 1st next year, I pay 1,000X. And then January 1st the year after, I pay 1,000X, okay? And so there is a true-up mechanism because what happens if I grow, right? So if in the olden days, going back to when it was just the perpetual licenses, let's say I added 100 users in here or 100 new whatever X. So I would pay this true-up, and the true-up was a one-time payment to the end of the contract, okay? So now I've got 1,000 plus 100, so I've got 1,100. So that's at year two. I pay for this on my year two anniversary. I can deploy them at any time throughout the year, but I don't pay for them until my anniversary. And basically, Microsoft's got a thing in their contract that says 30 to 60 days prior to January 1st, you need to go out and count and tell us how many you have. And if you're over 1,000, true those up. Okay. So that's great. We do a true up that pays out till the end. And then let's say in this year here, we go down 200, right? So now we're at 1,100 minus 200, we're at 900. Too bad, pay for your 1,000. Okay. So there's no true down. This is the perpetual license model. Okay. Now, in the O365 or M365 world, it's slightly different. Microsoft allows you to do a modified true down. Okay. So in this case, if I went, because there's subscriptions and I pay monthly upfront, okay. So I would pay 1,000 times whatever my monthly price is times 12 months. And then I add them in, and they add in through a reservation process. Okay. And that reservation process basically says, depending on how many months are left in the year, I add it in, I can use it. And on my anniversary date, if I added in 10 in the 10th month, I would pay, or 10 months left, I would pay 10 times 10 months times the unit price. And if I add another 10 in 9 months, I'd pay 10 times my unit price times 9 months. And at the end, there's just a running receipt, and I pay that as a reservation fee. So in this case, at the end of year one, they're at 1,100. Here they went down to 200. Okay. So this here, if you think about what ends up happening is here, what they paid for was the amount in here. So in year two, they actually pay 1,100 times 12, because now I'm paying for a full year. Okay. So now I come out, I don't do any reservations. It's bad time. COVID hits, we lay off 200 people. Okay. So now I'm down to 900. So what happens in this third year, right? The Microsoft allows a true down. I can go down to 900. No, I can only go down to 1,000. Whatever I signed up for in year one is the floor, and I have to maintain that number. So I don't have to pay for the 1,200 or for the 1,100. I can just pay for the 1,000, but because that's my floor, I have to pay for 1,000, right? Oh, yes. Sorry, guys. Jordan, wave at me. I don't know how to make you a co-host. I'll try. Let me see. Maybe that'll work. Okay. Haley, you might need to mute yourself again. Okay, so basically, I get that limited true down. I can just true down to what the floor was. Okay, and so that is a new concept with the subscriptions. Is I do have a true down, but it's a limited true down. Okay, so I'm just going to pause for a second. If anybody's got any questions, either pop them in, because I know that's a lot to sort of absorb, but this is the foundation of everything that we're about to talk to later today. Why the CSP program has benefits over the EA, why you have to plan what you're doing in order to shed these licenses. But that is sort of a high level history on the enterprise agreement, okay? So it looks like there's no one with questions, so I will go back here. So that's the EA program. So what Microsoft ended up doing 3-4 years ago now, they created what they call a CSP program. They have other programs called Open and stuff like that, and I'm not going to talk much about them because the Open program is actually going away. I'll probably touch on it a little bit. At a high level, just know that if I do mention Open is a transactional program where I don't commit to anything, just buy what I need at the time I need it. And it's sort of going away and getting collapsed into what they now call the CSP, or Cloud Solution Provider program, okay? And it first started out as another way to buy Office 365 and Azure primarily. And so when you first started out, the CSP really was just the O365 products, so those subscriptions. And basically what ends up happening is it is an indirect program through Microsoft. And so what that means is that there is a third party, a partner that you purchase these licenses through, versus that EA that is a direct relationship with, or direct billing relationship with Microsoft anyways. With the CSP, you purchase it through a reseller. Okay, there's two types of resellers. The type really doesn't matter. There's one that's direct. So some of the larger partners go direct to Microsoft,
And then there's some others that go indirect that have a distributor in between them and Microsoft. And that doesn't really matter, because what the difference between the CSP and the EA really is the partner actually can play a huge difference in the value that you get out of your Office 365 licenses. Because in the old model, it was locked to these 14 players that just sort of were going after large volumes of revenue. In the CSP model, you've got a partner that is more focused on not just reselling products. Most of the CSP partners are services partners. They're, Microsoft Gold partners. They do a lot of deployments and things like that. So there's a lot of different advantages to it. It was originally meant to fill that gap for organizations less than 500 seats, right? So it originally started at 250, but when you're an EA that's 200, let's say you're 300 CDA and you come up for renewal, Microsoft goes no more, you go into the CSP program, okay? And so it really was a place to push customers that weren't in an EA, they pushed them into the CSP program. So either you're in an EA and you're, that type of partner, or you get pushed into the CSP program in Microsoft I. And the reason that I say that, there's a video that I have on YouTube where I actually talk about some of the advantages of EA versus CSP, but I like to relate it to a car, right? And so if you're familiar with like kind of Nissan owns Nissan and then they own Infiniti. And so you have the Maxima from Nissan, you get the Infiniti G35 from Infiniti. And the cars are actually pretty much the same. They're the same chassis and everything. It's just the trim that gets different. So the Infiniti is considered a luxury car, right? And I went from a Maxima to an Infiniti, and the performance was pretty much the same. The difference was I started to have to put in premium fuel and these every time I went for an oil change, it was like $600 versus $100 in the Maxima. And so you paid for that premium brand, and EA is the premium brand with Microsoft, right? So it's really, and they're really taught to sell that thing. But I want to talk about why there's differences between the EA and the CSP and why there's some of the advantages, because when we get a little later into how to optimize cost, some of the cost optimization may come from flipping all of your licenses out of the EA to the CSP program, or subsets of your licenses out of EA to CSP, okay? And so we talked a little bit about that the M365 or the O365 were user-based licenses, and they're an enterprise product. And so an enterprise product has to be licensed. I mentioned this, that it has to be licensed for all qualified users. And so here's the definition of a qualified user to Microsoft. Anybody that comes into your network, basically, right? It's all your employees, it's any of your consultants, it's any of your contingency staff. So pretty much anybody that you're giving access to your network, because what they say is it's either anybody that is a user of a qualified device, so they're using one of your PCs or laptops, or they require access to an enterprise product client access license or an enterprise online service. So what's an enterprise client access license? Windows. So if you're putting them in Active Directory, they become a qualified employee. SCCM, if you're managing their device, they become a qualified employee. Exchange and SharePoint. If you give them an email address or access to SharePoint, they become a qualified employee, okay? Enterprise online services are just if you give them Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, or Teams access, pretty much, right? And so basically that means that every single employee needs to have an E license. So an E1, E3, or an E5, whether it's O or an O365 or an M365, okay? Now they do say there's a list of exemptions, and those are in the product terms. So I pulled out the product terms, and the exemptions are F-only licenses. Okay, and so Microsoft has an O365 F1 and an F3. And really what those are for people that do not have a dedicated device. So they're shared workstation kiosk user types. So examples of those would be in a hospital, healthcare professionals, nurses, anybody that walks up to a kiosk, they don't have their own PC, they walk up to a kiosk and they use that, right? So if you think in a hospital, that's a perfect example. Retail environments, there's another example, all the retail staff, You go into a retail store, they might have 4 or 5 PCs, but they have 40 or 50 staff, right? So those would be great examples of F workers. Manufacturing shop floor is another example of an F worker, right? Where people that are on the line don't have their own PC, but they may use a PC, at a kiosk station to check email or to go onto SharePoint or something like that. So pretty much everybody in your organization that has their own PC or accesses the stuff that doesn't use a shared PC requires an E license, whether they're using it or not. Okay. And that's a key thing to note, because I'm going to show you why I say that a little later today. There's a lot of times and a lot of examples where people actually aren't using this technology and they're paying for licenses for them. Okay. So I talked a little bit about the subscription reductions already. So again, this is from an EA. So subscription licenses are your Office 365. And there's 2 different types. I didn't talk about the 2 different types. I mentioned enterprise ones. Those are your E's, E1s, E3s, E5s, with the exception of your Fs, okay? Everything else that is a subscription license, Power BI, Visio Online, Project Online, Dynamics CRM, your F licenses are what you consider an additional online subscription, okay? And so we talked about how with the enterprise product in that example where they started at 1,000, went to 1,200, they paid for 1,000 in year 1, 1,200 in year 2, went to 900, had to stay at 1,000. So the enterprise has that floor of what you commit to. Additional online services allow you to go to as low as 0 on an anniversary date. You just have to give Microsoft 30 to 60 days notice and you can reduce those. So Power BI, I'm going to pick on a lot today. Power BI, Visio Online, Project Online. We had a client, 250 users, 80 Power BI licenses. We analyzed their use. They were using 15. They pulled $40,000 out of their contract by shedding 65 Power BI licenses that they thought their users were using. We showed them they weren't. They were able to do that because it was an additional online service. Okay, so they were in an EA, but because it was an additional online service, they were able to reduce that. Okay, so I've got a list of the things over here, phone systems, and there's all kinds of stuff. Dialing plans, like if you're on Teams using international dialing plans or conference calling bridges, all those things are considered subscriptions. Okay, so in the EA, the question that I always get asked is, I'm stuck, Mike, I prepaid for a year. So when can I make these changes? And the answer is on your anniversary date, you got to do it 30 days before, right? So if you have a July 1 anniversary date, which a lot of organizations do because Microsoft year end is June 30th and most of their contracts expire in June, you have to let Microsoft know, or the what they call LSP, your partner, know by May 31st of your reductions, and then you can reduce. So this is something that you need to be prepared for. We actually recommend that you monitor this on a monthly basis, and we'll talk about that later today. But if you're going to make reductions, you have to do it prior to your anniversary date. Okay, I'm talking EA specifically here. Okay, and then with those enterprise products, so those E SKUs, I can only reduce to what I signed for. Right. So if we had a bad business downturn, too bad, you're stuck at what you signed for at the minimum, the floor. But all the additional products I can go to as low as 0 if I so choose to. Okay. So what's different with the CSP program? There is no definition of enterprise products. And that is a huge difference, because what does that mean? It means 2 things. It means, 1, I do not have to license all my users with an E SKU, because there's no such thing as an enterprise product that hits qualified user definition. I can license them for what they're actually using. And the other thing is, now you can prepay for a year on CSP, but you can also go month to month. So depending on how you've bought those licenses in the CSP, you can make reductions every single month if you choose to. So I'm not stuck, whereas in that EA, I prepay for the year up front, and then I do reservations throughout the year to my anniversary date. In the CSP, it can be done month to month, And that means that if I put a license on this month and no longer use it next month, I can take it off. In the EA, if I put a license on this month and I'm in 10 months of my, still got 10 months left in the year, I pay for 10 months worth of that license. So there's definitely an advantage there from the CSP program, okay? And there are some things that we even make recommendations for, because from a pricing perspective, because I think that's my next slide, yes, what about pricing? So with the EA, I'll talk about this and then I'll go back to some of the advantages of the CSP program. With an EA, the list price on CSP is equal to the list price on an EA, okay? So level A EA and CSP list price are the same. Because Microsoft sells direct on the EA, if they do not discount the EA, the margin that a CSP partner has is their advantage from a pricing perspective if they need it to give that up, okay? So as long as Microsoft is not discounting a level A EA, you could sell it at list and be the same price. And then if we talk about the other advantages, like being able to shift in a month-to-month perspective, you may be able to sell it at list. If you're in a little bit of a competitive situation, your margin is your advantage, okay? And so that's something that's important to know for the partners. For our clients that are on the phone, it's important to know that the way that this works is that anybody that is a level A EA, so 250, now 500 to 2,400 users, should definitely be going to talk to CSP partners about what value they bring that their LSP, the reseller, the EA does not, and be looking at what they're doing from a licensing perspective. Again, when we get into those sorts of details later today, from a licensing perspective, is there something that I can be doing that's different from the EA that saves me money? And we had a retailer that was in this situation. They were actually level B, but because of the fact that the way that Microsoft looked at their employees, they weren't actually using kiosks, couldn't use the F SKUs, and were being forced to buy E1s for all of their retail employees that were only checking email to get their pay stubs. Right? We moved them to the CSP program. They bought them Exchange Online SKUs, saved something like $600,000 a year, even though they were paying a little bit more for their E3 licenses. All right, so it looks like we have a question. So an organization with 1,000 employees, i.e. a manufacturing plant, must pay for all 1,000 employees regardless, with 40% of the users are not using O365. Yes, that would be correct, unless they can, inside of the EA, that would be correct. Under CSP, that would not be correct. CSP, they could pay for just who's using it. But under the EA, they would have to pay for all 1,000, and the only exception would be if they could exclude any of those under those F plans. So if they had qualified users that were using kiosks, they could buy F plans for them, but they would still have to license 1,000, right? It's just they would license the F plans, which are a lot cheaper than the E plans. Thomas, that answer that for you? Perfect. Okay, so the CSP question I get asked about next is, okay, I get it. It's built for Office 365. What about my Windows and SQL servers and maybe some Project and Visio and things like that that aren't the online subscriptions? So Microsoft has made some recent changes where these products are getting put into the CSP. I still don't see them as being all that advantageous because they're making them subscriptions. Although in the newer versions of the products, just as an FYI, Windows Server, they just announced the newer version, but portions of it are only going to be subscriptions. Different editions are only going to be subscriptions. And I have a feeling that within the next 2 years, Windows will only be a subscription license and SQL is going the same way. So I don't think they're going to have perpetual licenses anymore. That's coming for all of their server products like Windows and SQL. But today, the way that would work is there's a few different options and there's some analysis that would need to be done to figure out which one it is. You could potentially put them on the CSP, depending on what you have. If you have software assurance and you're only paying for SA, to move them into the CSP as subscriptions would be more expensive, but there may be some advantages to that depending on what your plan is around cloud. And I'm not going to get into it today, but if you're going to AWS, for instance, that actually might be a really good strategy. If you're going to Azure, maybe not so much because the SA still has some value there. So again, it takes a little bit of an analysis, but You could purchase them through CSP. They have what they call an MPSA. So an MPSA, I didn't talk about that. I can't remember I always forget what that stands for, but basically it's a transactional program that you tie to your EA, or as long as you're purchasing a little bit of volume, you can get that, and you can purchase them through that. You can purchase them through that open program that I mentioned. So there's 3 or 4 different options there, and we have seen a number of clients that have saved money moving to the CSP and then choosing one of these as an option. We even sometimes even look at it and say, well, hey, just do a core cal over on your EA, or just put, one thing on the EA. And then, because once you have one on, you can still get all your additional products on there. So, there's different ways to mix and match these things. It just takes a little bit of analysis to figure out which way to go and which one makes the most sense. But the reality is, when you're looking at, if you're talking about doing a switch from an EA to CSP, you're going to do a full on analysis. Okay, and that's a little bit more than what we're going to talk about today, but that gives you sort of a high level. They're not left out there. There's still things to do, and when you look at your overall cost, it still could be advantageous to move to the EA, to the CSP, and do these products. You might have some sort of hybrid. Okay, so just wanted to give you an example of what this client, our client, they had a CS. They originally started with an EA. It was for 900 users. They had O365 E3 on there. They had other online services such as Project and Visio on there. They also had various on-premise servers, so their Windows and SQL servers primarily. It was costing them about $475,000 a year. They had a fairly sizable Azure agreement at about $200,000 as well. And we went in and we looked at their usage. And when we looked at the 900 users, they all were not using those O365 E3s. And they definitely did not need Project on every desktop. And we went through and did a proper analysis. But when we ended up looking at it, what ended up happening was we moved them from 475,000 a year to 380. So we saved them just shy of $100,000 on their licenses. And by working with a strategic CSP partner, they actually even reduced their Azure spend by 5%, because the CSP partner had some innovative services that allowed them to save 5% on the 200,000. And their CSP partner put a plan in place to help them reduce that by another 22% by working on doing some things with reserved instances and things like that over time. And so this is not atypical, by the way. A 90,000 savings, that's almost 25% delta on the licensing cost, and they ended up reducing their Azure spend by 22%. So these guys put about over $100,000 back into their IT budget. And I use this as an example because a lot of the times people are like, oh, this only works in the really big clients. That's not the case. These sorts of things work in any sort of customer, and I'm going to show you what the types of things that we did with those 900 licenses. So if you're on here and you're you got 30,000 users, or you got 900 users, or 200 or 100,000 users, these tactics will work for you. And this is sort of what this is the sort of results that we can help you get. Okay,